I was halfway down the mountain road when my phone lit up with the kind of call that makes your stomach drop before you even answer. "Mara, honey." Mrs. Rowan whispered, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard. "There's a moving truck in your driveway. Your parents are here, and your sister, and the kids. They said you knew." I didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't speak. A cold rush spread down my spine as I pulled the phone away just long enough to stare at her words on the screen, hoping I'd misheard. But she kept going, almost apologetic. "Your mama told the movers it's family property. They're carrying boxes inside." My heart slammed against my ribs. Family property. She'd actually said it. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, the tires sliding slightly on the gravel curve as I pressed harder on the gas. The wind whipped against the windows, each gust sounding like a warning. If they had a moving truck there, if they were already inside, then this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was planned. I crested the last rise before the cabin, dread swelling in my throat like something physical lodged there, choking me. And as the rooflines came into view, framed by the sharp silhouettes of the Colorado pines, I realized one terrible truth: my family was moving into my mountain house without asking. I turned into my driveway too fast, causing the gravel to spit out behind me. The first thing I saw was the massive white moving truck. Its rear door rolled up a metal ramp, angling down toward the ground. Then the bodies: my mother directing the movers with one hand on her hip, my father leaning against the truck like he owned the place, and Lydia, my older sister, carrying a box, while Owen and little Piper darted around the yard, climbing rocks, kicking pine cones, laughing as if this was some weekend adventure. My mother spotted me first and smiled like she'd been waiting for me to bring lemonade. "There she is," she called out. "Perfect timing. Help us with these boxes. We need to get the heavy stuff in first." I stepped out of my car slowly, the cold mountain air filling my lungs like ice. It took me several seconds to speak, to force my voice past the shock strangling it. "What are you doing here?" Mom waved her hand casually like I was the one being dramatic. "Mara, sweetheart, don't start. We're moving in. You live alone up here and your sister and the kids need space. This is family property." My vision tunneled for a second. "No," I said, each word shaking. "It's not." Lydia rolled her eyes as she dropped a box onto the porch with a loud thud. "God, you're so uptight. You barely use this place. We'll make it a real home." A real home. My home. Bought with my savings, my down payment, my mortgage payments. Every ounce of this cabin belonged to me. Not them, not family. Me. I took a step forward. "I didn't invite you here." "That's the thing," Dad said, brushing sawdust off his jeans like he'd just finished a day's worth of honest labor. "You don't need to invite us. We helped with the down payment. Remember, that makes this shared." I stared at him, stunned. "You gave me $1,000. The house cost $400,000. "Money is money," Mom snapped. "Don't be petty. Family doesn't nickel and dime each other." My pulse hammered in my ears. Family also doesn't break into someone's home. We didn't break in, Lydia said, flipping her hair back as she swung open the screen door. The key was in the planter, like always. "You should really hide it better." I felt sick. Owen ran toward me, then sandy blonde hair flying behind him. "Mommy said I get the room upstairs with the big window. Grandma said you won't mind." I blinked at him. Grandma said what? Piper grabbed her brother's hand and added proudly, "Grandma said this is our new home. We won't have to leave." That hit me harder than anything else. They had told the children. They had prepared them. They had created a reality where this wasn't trespassing. It was entitlement. I walked past them, needing to see the damage for myself. The cabin door was wide open. Inside, movers were carrying in a dresser I'd never seen before. A recliner that wasn't mine sat lopsided near the entryway. My pantry door hung open, boxes of their food stacked on my shelves. My refrigerator door stood ajar, filled with items they'd brought from home. Mom's leftovers, Lydia's juice boxes, Piper's yogurt pouches, everything crammed beside my groceries like I wasn't even a separate person. I swallowed hard. Stop. Everyone stop. Mom sighed loudly, annoyed, like I was the one ruining her day. "Mara, please don't make a scene. You always get like this." I turned to her, feeling my face flush with a mix of shame and fury. "You need to leave." "We're not leaving," Lydia said flatly. "Move-in day is Saturday, but we figured we'd start early." The kids were excited. Move-in day. They'd planned this so thoroughly they had a date, a plan, a schedule. And I had never even been part of the conversation. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like an old rope breaking after years of strain. For as long as I could remember, I had been the dependable one, the responsible one, the giver. The one who paid the loans that were never repaid, who covered birthday parties and grocery shortages, who babysat last minute because Lydia was overwhelmed. Every time I'd tried to say no, I'd been scolded, guilted, punished. And now this. They were stealing my home because they believed they had the right to it. I took a slow breath. "I'm going inside," I said. "When I come back out, I expect all of this gone." Mom actually laughed. "Oh, sweetheart. You'll adjust. Families share." I didn't answer. I walked back inside, my hands trembling as I shut the front door. The cabin felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in around me. I leaned against the door, hearing the muffled voices outside, Mom giving instructions, Lydia ordering the movers to bring in more boxes, Dad telling the kids to stay where I can see you. My sanctuary was dissolving around me, and no one on the other side of that door cared. I pushed myself upright and walked into the kitchen, breathing through the tightness in my chest. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked it. I scrolled to the number I'd searched last night, hesitated, then typed it in again. A locksmith, the closest one in Cedar County. The cursor blinked on the call button. My thumb hovered. If I called, there was no going back. I closed my eyes, hearing Mom's voice from outside, shrill, confident, claiming things that did not belong to her, claiming my life as if it were a piece of furniture she could rearrange. Family adjusts. Not anymore. I pressed call. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. A gruff voice answered Walter's lock and key. I swallowed. "Hi. I need every lock on my house changed. Today." There was a pause. "Everything all right, ma'am?" "No," I said quietly. "But it will be." I ended the call, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My legs felt unsteady, but my resolve had never been clearer. I walked to the window and looked out at the scene unfolding in my driveway, my mother waving at movers, my father pacing, Lydia leaning against her minivan, arms crossed, triumphant. Owen and Piper chasing each other around my pine trees as if they'd lived here their whole lives. None of them looked worried. None of them doubted this would work. They fully expected me to fold like I always had. But this time, something was different. I stepped back from the window and locked the door, my door. Then I whispered more to myself than to them, "Not for one more day." And for the first time in my life, I meant it. The moment I hung up with Walter, the silence inside the cabin pressed against my ears like a physical weight. Outside, my family moved with purpose, a rhythm too organized, too practiced, too familiar for something supposedly spontaneous. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't confusion. It was a choreography. I watched them through the narrow slit of the window. Mom pointed toward the upper level as 2 movers carried a box labeled Linens, Lydia. My father walked toward the shed as if inspecting the property he owned. Lydia had her phone out, scrolling casually, confident enough to look bored. The kids darted around them, matching their energy and assumptions. No one hesitated. No one questioned. No one even looked toward my front door. They genuinely believed they belonged here. I backed away from the window. My breath shook in my chest, not out of panic anymore, but out of something darker, recognition. I'd seen this pattern before. The way Mom took over my childhood bedroom when I moved out for college, calling it shared space. The way Lydia moved into my old apartment for 3 months until she figured out her life, then stayed for 10, and never cleaned up after her kids. The way Dad expected me to contribute to car payments, I didn't use medical bills I wasn't involved in, and vacations I wasn't invited to. A taker didn't suddenly become a giver. A boundary crosser didn't learn manners overnight. This wasn't new behavior. This was simply the first time they had tried it with something big enough for me to fight back. I rubbed my temples and forced myself to breathe evenly. I needed clarity, not panic. I needed a plan. So I went upstairs to my office and pulled out the file box I kept my paperwork in. Mortgage statements, closing documents, tax receipts, insurance policies, proof of every payment made by me alone month after month. I stacked them neatly on the desk, my hand steadier with each page I laid down. Facts were my anchor. Paper didn't lie. Paper didn't manipulate. Paper didn't twist love into obligation. I heard a loud crash outside, something dropping. My stomach clenched. I rushed to the window in time to see a cardboard box split open on the porch. A framed picture slid out and shattered glass scattering across the wooden planks. Lydia groaned dramatically. "Seriously, can you be careful?" she snapped at the mover. The man apologized and bent down to gather the shards. I couldn't help noticing what the photo was: Lydia holding Piper, both of them smiling in front of a Christmas tree I had never been invited to stand beside. Someone had written "Family Forever" on the frame. Family forever, but only when it benefited them. Mom clapped her hands sharply. "Let's keep it moving. We still have a sofa and 2 dressers in the truck. We don't have all day. The word tasted bitter even in my mind. I closed the curtains before they noticed me watching. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Mrs. Rowan appeared on the screen. "Just checking on you, sweetheart." "Are you okay?" I typed back. "I'm handling it. Please don't let them talk to you or say things on my behalf." Her reply was immediate. "I won't. But they've been asking around the neighborhood all week." I froze. A cold prickle moved over my skin. All week I stared at those 2 words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less incriminating. But no matter how many times I reread them, the message was the same. This wasn't a spontaneous takeover. They had been preparing. A hollow feeling opened in my stomach. My family hadn't just impulsively decided to move into my home. They had surveyed the land, asked questions, spread stories, told the neighborhood they were expected here, maybe even intended to establish residency before confronting me. That's why they acted so confident. They believed they had a narrative ready to weaponize. A knock sounded at my door from outside, a hard, insistent rap. Mom's voice followed, muffled but sharp. "Mara, open this door. We need to put the mattresses inside before it gets damp." I stayed perfectly still. "Mara." She knocked again, harder. "Stop acting like a child. Let us in." I didn't speak. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Lydia's voice piped up next, high and biting. "This is so typical of you, always making things harder than they need to be. Just open the door." Footsteps shifted. Dad's voice replaced theirs, softer, but no less manipulative. "Mara, let's talk about this. Don't do something we all regret. There it was again. I stepped back into the hallway, away from the door, afraid my voice might carry. Let them think I wasn't home. Let them pound until they were tired. I wasn't opening anything. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. Then I heard Dad say to Mom, "We'll try again later. She'll come around." No, I wouldn't. Not this time. I went back to the office and forced myself to sit down. My hands trembled as I reached for the mortgage papers again. I tried to focus on the words, the legalities, the date of purchase, but all I could see was the image of that shattered photo frame on my porch. Family forever. If forever meant endlessly taking, endlessly assuming, endlessly crossing boundaries, then forever wasn't love. It was ownership, and I was done being owned. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Mara," a calm voice asked. "This is Deputy Hartman with the Cedar County Sheriff's Office. I'm returning your call from earlier." Relief flooded my chest. I sat straighter. "Yes, thank you for calling back. I need to know what my options are." He asked me to explain the situation, so I did, slowly, methodically, breathing through the tremors in my voice. I told him they had arrived uninvited with a moving truck. that they had entered my home, that they claimed it was family property, that I had asked them to leave and they refused. He asked questions, good ones. Is the mortgage in your name? Are they listed on the deed? Do they receive mail at your address? Have they lived there previously? Each answer was a firm no. Then he said the sentence that loosened something tight in my chest. Legally, they have no standing to occupy your residence. If they attempt to enter again without your permission, you can treat it as trespassing and call us immediately. He continued. But if they establish themselves inside, if they bring beds, personal items, and begin residing there, it becomes more complicated. Colorado law requires an eviction process if someone is considered an occupant. A chill crawled up my spine. That's why they had mattresses. That's why they had dressers. That's why they had food. That's why they had been confident. They were trying to establish residency. Deputy, I whispered, they came here planning to stay. A pause. Then I suggest preventing them from getting inside again. Document everything, and don't hesitate to call when they return. After I hung up, I sat frozen for a long moment. The pieces slid into place one by one, forming a picture so sinister it left me breathless. My family wasn't invading in a fit of misguided generosity. They were executing a step-by-step plan to take my house. I stood abruptly, my chair rolling back behind me. I gathered the paperwork into a neat pile, then walked downstairs. The cabin felt tighter, smaller, as if the walls themselves sensed the threat pressing against them. When I reached the living room, I hesitated before the window. Slowly, I pulled the curtain aside a fraction of an inch. Mom was standing by the truck, speaking animatedly to one of the movers while pointing toward the upper-level loft. Lydia was lifting Piper onto the porch railing, letting her balance dangerously on the edge while Owen clapped. Dad had drifted toward my garage, peering into the windows, as though assessing tools and equipment he might claim as his. Their movements weren't chaotic. They were purposeful, coordinated, predatory. A wave of anger surged through me, sharp, pure cleansing. It didn't shake like fear. It didn't burn like panic. It simply rose steady and clear, filling spaces inside me I didn't know were empty. Enough. I let the curtain fall and turned away from the window. I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. Not my home, not my peace, not my sense of belonging. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a voicemail notification. Curiosity tugged at me. I tapped to listen. Mom's voice filled the room tight with frustration. Mara, stop hiding. This is ridiculous. Your sister and the kids need a place, and you have plenty of space. We already told everyone we're moving up here. You need to stop being selfish and let this happen. I deleted it. Another voicemail played automatically, this time from Lydia. Mara, open the damn door. We're family. Families share. You don't get to isolate yourself like this. You're not better than us. I deleted that one too. The third was from Dad, calmer but heavier. Mara, for God's sake, just talk to us. Your mother is upset. The kids are confused. You can't keep doing this. Let us in. Delete. I didn't want their voices in my house anymore. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The noise outside rose and fell. Footsteps dropped boxes, the hum of the truck engine, kids laughing, Mom's orders slicing through the air. Then slowly, it quieted. I walked to the window again. The movers were closing the truck door. Mom was speaking with Dad, gesturing wildly. Lydia paced, phone pressed to her ear, annoyance tightening her shoulders. Then Lydia pointed directly at my front door and said something sharp. Dad nodded. And for one beat, all three of them stared at the house as if waiting for it to open itself. But it didn't. They didn't win this time. A strange, steadying calm washed over me. I looked toward the table where my deed and mortgage papers lay in a neat stack. Proof, truth, ownership. They weren't taking this from me. Not today, not ever. I picked up my phone and typed a new message to Mrs. Rowan. Thank you again. Please don't let them speak for me. They don't represent me. Her reply came quickly, warm and certain. Of course, dear. And Mara, you're doing the right thing. I exhaled shakily. Maybe for the first time in my life, I believed that too. I stood in the kitchen long enough for the sun to shift across the wooden floorboards, long enough for the hum of activity outside to settle into a rhythm that sounded too comfortable, too familiar. When I finally walked back toward the front of the house, something inside me slowed. I paused at the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see what waited outside. And there she was, my mother directing the movers toward the steps, as though she'd personally bought this land and built the cabin with her bare hands. Her finger jabbed toward the loft window. "Be careful with that one. It goes upstairs. My good dishes are in there." My heart thudded painfully. "Your good dishes," her voice carried across the yard like a command, not a request, and Lydia moved beneath it, carrying a box with a look of martyrdom, as if performing a heroic act rather than inserting herself into a life she had no right to. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. Then I pushed open the front door. Everything stopped. My mother turned first, plastering on a smile that felt like a slap. Finally, she said, "You can help with the rest of the boxes. We need to get the mattresses in before the weather shifts." "No." The word came out quiet but solid, rooted in a place I didn't know I had. Everyone stop. A few movers froze mid-step. Lydia looked up sharply. My father paused at the foot of the porch, hands on his hips. But my mother only sighed as if inconvenienced. "Oh, Mara, don't start. We don't have time for one of your moods." I felt heat crawl up my neck. "Get your things off my property." Lydia let out a mocking laugh. "Our property, Mara. Mom and Dad helped with the down payment." "Don't act like you did this alone." I stared at her. "They gave me $1,000. The mortgage is mine. The deed is mine. I pay the taxes. I pay for every inch of this place." Mom waved her hand dismissively. "You get so hung up on numbers. Family doesn't do math. Family shares. Family shares." My ribcage tightened at the hypocrisy. My entire life had been proof that family only shared when I was the one giving. I stepped forward. "You cannot move into my house." Lydia pressed her hand against her hip, eyebrow arched. "We're already here, and the kids love it. Why make a big deal out of something that helps everyone?" As if summoned, Owen came around the corner of the house, cheeks red with excitement. "Mommy, can we see the big window room now? Grandma said it's mine." Piper trailed behind him, clutching a pine cone. "Grandma said Auntie won't mind." The impact was sharp and immediate, as though someone had grabbed a taut string inside my chest and snapped it. They had told the kids they were moving in. They'd promised rooms, promised a home, promised belonging, all without asking me. I crouched slightly, looking Piper in the eyes. "Sweetheart, you can play in the yard for now, okay, but no one is moving in today?" Her little brow wrinkled. "Grandma said you'd try to stop us." My breath left in a single painful exhale. Lydia swooped in immediately, pulling Piper against her side. "Don't confuse them," she snapped. "They've had a long morning." My mother stepped closer, planting herself on the porch step like a queen ascending her throne. "This is happening, Mara. You're the only one making it unpleasant." I straightened. "I want everyone off my property." Dad finally joined the circle, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. "Mara, we talked about this." "No," I cut in sharply. "You talked about it, to yourselves, before ever speaking to me." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. For a brief flickering moment, I saw something like guilt in his eyes, before it hardened into annoyance. My mother pointed toward the moving truck. "We're not doing this. You're overwhelmed. Go inside, collect yourself, and when you come back out, we'll finish. Finish. As if this were a remodel, a group project, a cooperation. This isn't yours," I said. My voice cracking only slightly. Mom rolled her eyes. "Everything that belongs to a family member belongs to the family. That's how we raised you." "No," I whispered. "It's how you drained me." A box slipped in a mover's hands, landing with a soft thud as the tension rippled outward. Lydia crossed her arms, tilting her head in that condescending way she'd perfected years ago. "Wow, dramatic much." I felt the pressure behind my eyes, the burning urge to scream, to cry, to wilt under their collective expectations the way I always had. But instead, something steadier rose. Anger shaped into clarity. "I'm done," I said. "I'm done being used. I'm done being the one who gives while everyone else takes. Get off my property." My mother's face hardened. "You're having one of your tantrums." The word hit me like a slap. Tantrum. A label they'd slapped onto me every time I tried to protect myself, whenever I resisted lending money, whenever I declined a last-minute babysitting request, whenever I dared to say no. Tantrum. But this time I didn't shrink. "I'm going inside," I told them, "and when I come back out, I expect you all to be gone." Mom scoffed. "Sweetheart, this is happening whether you approve or not." I turned, stepping over the threshold of my home. Behind me, Lydia muttered loudly, "She's embarrassing herself." Dad's voice followed softer but cutting, "Let her cool off. She'll cave." I closed the door and locked it. Their muffled indignation vibrated through the wood. I stepped back, letting the weight of the moment settle over me. This was the first boundary I'd set in years, and they were pounding on it already. A fist slammed against the door. "Mara, open this right now," Mom shouted. "We have mattresses out here. I'm not opening," I said loud enough for them to hear. "God," Lydia groaned. "You are impossible." Dad's voice came next. "Talk to us. Don't escalate." I backed away until my legs hit the couch. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from the unfamiliar sensation of not giving in. I wiped my palms on my jeans, pacing. I needed to check the back door, the garage, the deck door. They knew too many ways into this house. I hurried through the cabin, locking every window, sliding every bolt. My breath quickened as I checked the mudroom. The lock held tight. Then I checked the basement door, its frame old but strong. I pressed my palm to the cool wood. No one was coming in. Not today. Returning to the living room, I glanced at the curtains and pulled them closed. The walls vibrated faintly with shouts, outside voices rising and falling, incredulous, that I wasn't bending, wasn't folding the way I always had. My phone buzzed in my back pocket. A text from Mrs. Rowan. "They told the UPS guy earlier that they're moving in permanently." I didn't say anything. My throat tightened. Permanently. They had rehearsed this. They had distributed the story. They had spread it like seeds across the community, ensuring it would sprout into something believable before I had a chance to deny it. I typed back with trembling fingers. "Thank you for letting me know. Please don't engage with them. They're not speaking for me." She responded, "I know. And if you need anything at all, you call me." Warmth pricked my eyes. The quiet kind of warmth that comes when someone believes you without requiring proof. A voice boomed from outside, jarring me back into the moment. "Mara," my father shouted, "this is your last chance before we bring in the furniture." I exhaled slowly. They weren't going to stop. They weren't going to reconsider. They weren't going to treat this as anything other than their right. I walked to the center of the living room, listening to the muffled chaos outside. Then, with steady hands, I reached for my phone again. Deputy Hartman's number was still near the top of the call log, but I didn't dial him. Not yet. First, I needed to create space to think. Space they couldn't intrude on. I sat down on the floor, crossed my legs, and closed my eyes. This is mine. The cabin creaked softly as the wind pressed against its walls, a familiar grounding sound. The smell of pine sap drifted in through the cracked window frame. For a moment it was just me and the mountains and the heartbeat of a place I had chosen for myself. Then a loud scrape jolted me upright. Someone trying the back door. My pulse spiked. I ran to the hallway and heard Lydia's voice faintly on the other side of the house. She locked it. "Check the garage." I swallowed a surge of panic and whispered into the empty air, "It's okay. They're not getting in." Still, I moved from window to window, ensuring every latch was tight. Outside, they regrouped. Mom yelled something unintelligible. Dad argued with her. The movers stood around awkwardly, unsure whether to keep hauling or get in their truck and run. The tension thickened into something nearly tangible, like the moment before a thunderstorm splits open the sky. I returned to the door and pressed my back against it. Their shadows moved beneath the gap at the bottom, restless, impatient, entitled. Mara Mom called voice, suddenly sweet syrupy in a way that made my skin crawl. Honey, open the door. We can talk. I didn't move. Don't be unreasonable, she continued. We'll get along just fine once everything's settled. I closed my eyes. Then, clear, as if whispered directly into my ear, I heard Lydia say the words that locked everything into place. You don't get to call cops on your own family. My eyes opened slowly. I wasn't sure if they were daring me or warning me. Either way, the decision was already made. I wasn't letting them inside. Not now, not ever. I stepped away from the door, gripping my phone, and whispered into the quiet, if I have to fight, then I will. And for the first time, I truly meant it. The morning the locksmith was scheduled to arrive, the mountain was wrapped in a pale, silvery fog that muffled every sound. It made the cabin feel suspended in a quiet pocket of air, like the world was holding its breath with me. I hadn't slept, not really. I'd closed my eyes, but my mind replayed every moment from the day before: my mother's commands, my father's disappointment, Lydia's entitlement, their boxes crossing my threshold, their voices claiming what wasn't theirs. By sunrise, the fog began to slide down the slope, revealing thin beams of golden light. I stood at the front door, staring at the driveway, waiting for the first sign of Walter's truck. That's when I noticed the glove. A single black leather glove sat on the porch step, damp with dew. Out of place, out of context. I bent down and picked it up with 2 fingers. It wasn't mine, it wasn't left by the movers. And it wasn't the kind of glove worn by hikers passing through. My throat tightened. Someone had been close to the house, close enough to drop this with no reason to be on my property. The sheriff's words replayed in my head. Keep them from getting inside. I set the glove on the porch railing, forcing my breath to slow. It didn't matter who had dropped it. After today, no one would be getting inside again. At exactly 7:48 a.m., a dusty brown pickup rumbled up my driveway. A man in his early 50s stepped out, shoulders broad, his tool belt hanging low. He had a calm demeanor, the kind people in the mountains carry like second nature. His name, stitched onto his work shirt, read, Walter. He gave me a polite nod. Morning, ma'am. Heard you need every lock replaced? I nodded. Every single one. He tilted his head slightly, the question unspoken. Family trouble. He didn't ask it out loud, but I saw it in his eyes. Maybe he'd seen it before. Maybe mountain homes brought out the worst in people who wanted what wasn't theirs. Yes, I finally said. Family trouble. He didn't push further. I'll start with the front, then the back doors, then the side entry and basement. Shouldn't take long. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt a shred of relief. Small, fragile, but real. As he unpacked his tools, I stepped aside, letting him begin. The metallic clicks of the drill sounded like punctuation marks, each one a quiet declaration. This is mine. This is mine. This is mine. I hovered nearby, unsure whether to help or anxiously supervise. The cabin creaked as the temperature changed, the old pine siding expanding in the morning light. Walter worked efficiently, unscrewing old bolts, inserting new deadbolts, testing them twice with calm precision. You picked a beautiful place up here, he said as he tightened a hinge. Wish I had a place like this. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. Thank you. It was a dream of mine. He looked over at me briefly. Always someone trying to take the things we work hardest for. My chest tightened, not because he meant anything specific, but because the truth of that sentence hit deeper than he probably realized. I nodded. Yes, exactly. He didn't pry, didn't ask for details. Instead, he simply moved to the next door. But as he rounded the cabin toward the back, I followed, and that's when we both noticed the SUV. An unfamiliar older model SUV sat idling at the edge of the drive, its windows tinted dark. It faced the cabin but didn't pull in. It just sat there. Walter noticed it too. Friend of yours, no. The SUV lingered for another long second. Then it rolled slowly down the hill, disappearing around the bend. My stomach dropped. Lydia. It had to be. She had probably driven by to see if I'd opened the door, or if I'd changed my mind, or if the locks were still the same. But she would be disappointed. The locks were changing. Walter glanced at me but didn't comment. Instead, he finished the back door and moved on to the basement entry. This one's old, he said, tapping the frame. I'll reinforce it. Please do. While he worked, I walked back inside and pulled out every important document I owned: deed, mortgage, tax statements, insurance policy. I laid them across the dining table in neat rows, the official paper forming a barrier between truth and the lies my family had been spreading. As I ran my finger across the embossed seal of the deed, something in me hardened. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't being selfish. I wasn't being unreasonable. I was defending my home. A quiet knock sounded at the open front door. I turned quickly, heart pounding. Mrs. Rowan stood there, hands clutching a small container covered with foil. Her face was warm, though worry softened the corners of her eyes. I baked muffins, she said gently. Thought you might need something to eat. My shoulders loosened a fraction. Thank you. She stepped inside, glancing around. I saw the truck. Good idea, smart girl. I exhaled shakily. I found a glove on the porch this morning. Her brows knitted together. A glove. What kind of glove? Leather. Men's. Not from the movers. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Well, I didn't want to worry you, but last night I thought I heard someone on your property. Ice slid through my chest. Last night, she nodded. Around 11. My dogs started barking, so I looked out the back window. Didn't see anything, but I felt something. Like someone was watching. Yes. Exactly. My pulse quickened. Lydia drove by this morning. I think it was her. Or someone else from the family, she murmured. A heavy quiet settled between us. Not fear, not panic, just an understanding one that acknowledged the truth I'd been trying not to face. They're not done, I whispered. No, she agreed softly. But you're not alone. I swallowed hard. Thank you for saying that. She placed a hand on my arm. You did the right thing yesterday, dear. Boundaries help everyone see the truth, even if they don't like it. Before I could respond, the metallic clink of Walter's tools sounded again outside. Mrs. Rowan squeezed my arm once more. I'll let you finish. Call me if you need anything. After she left, I carried the muffins to the counter and stared at them, feeling something odd and bittersweet stirring in me. Support. The simple, quiet kind. It had been a long time since I felt it. By the time Walter finished the last door, the sun was sharper, melting through the fog and warming the deck. All set, he said, handing me 3 new keys on a metal ring. Front, back, side, basement. Every lock's changed, deadbolts reinforced. I took the keys, feeling their weight like armor. Thank you. He nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth. If anyone tries to get in now, you'll know. And if they come back, don't open the door. Call the sheriff. His voice held no judgment, only caution born of experience. I will, I said. He tipped his cap and left his truck rolling down the driveway until it disappeared into the trees. For a moment I stood there alone, holding the keys against my chest. They felt cold in my palm, unfamiliar but powerful. My house was safe again, at least for now. Inside, my phone buzzed with a new message. I almost ignored it, but something in me compelled me to check. It was from my mother. A different number. She'd used another phone. Mara, you need to stop this. We are family. We will not be pushed out. This is our home too. My throat clenched as I typed only 5 words. Do not come back here. I locked the screen before another response could appear. The house felt brighter than it had yesterday. Airier. More mine. I drifted through the living room, up the stairs into the loft, touching the railings, the window frames, the furniture I'd saved years to buy. Nothing was being taken today. Nothing was being claimed. but peace was fragile. Even as I walked the quiet rooms, the shadows along the wall reminded me that locks could be changed, but intentions didn't dissolve that easily. That glove wasn't an accident. That SUV wasn't random. That silence from my family wasn't surrender. This was the beginning of a longer fight, a fight for my home, my boundaries, my right to say no. But as I stood at the window looking down at the empty driveway, something steadier rose inside me. Not panic, not exhaustion, resolve. I closed the curtains, tightened my grip on the keys, and whispered into the quiet cabin, "You don't get to take this from me. Not anymore." And for the first time, the house felt like it agreed. My phone began buzzing before I even made it downstairs the next morning. At first, it blended into the ordinary sounds of the cabin, the creak of old wood, the soft whisper of wind against the siding. But it didn't stop. It kept vibrating again and again until a knot formed in my stomach. I set my coffee mug on the counter and finally looked. 8 missed calls from Mom, 5 from Dad, 11 text messages from Lydia, and more numbers I didn't recognize, likely cousins, aunts, neighbors they had recruited. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. I hadn't even opened a single message yet. I clicked on Mom's first. "Mara, you embarrassed all of us yesterday. Fix this now. Fix this." As if I had done something wrong. The next message from her came seconds later, almost frantic. "The kids didn't sleep last night because of you. You need to think about someone besides yourself, besides myself." The irony almost made me laugh. I scrolled further. "If you don't answer, we will have no choice but to take action. Take action." There it was, the threat tucked neatly between guilt and manipulation. I clicked Lydia's thread next. Her messages were longer as always. She never used 10 words when she could use 200. "I can't believe you locked your own family out. Do you understand how cruel that was? Owen asked why you hate us. I didn't know what to tell him. You never let us in literally or emotionally. Maybe this is who you really are." Then we weren't trying to take anything from you. We were trying to build something with you. But you're too selfish to see it. Then, a few lines later, "If you don't let us move in, we will take the next step." My breath caught. The next step. I didn't know what that meant yet, but a chill ran through me. My family didn't make empty threats. They escalated until they got what they wanted. The phone rang suddenly, one of the random numbers. I answered without thinking. "Mara, how could you do this to your mother?" my Aunt Caroline shouted. "She told us you shoved them out like strangers." I blinked, stunned. "I what? That's not true. They tried to move into my house without asking. They brought a truck. They invited themselves." "That's not what she said," Aunt Caroline snapped. "She said you threw your own niece and nephew onto the street." My throat tightened. "They live with my parents, Caroline. They have a home." "Well, she sniffed your mother didn't tell it that way. Of course she didn't." I hung up before she could continue. Another call came, then another. Every ring chipped away at something inside me. Every accusation scraped against old wounds that had never healed properly. I set the phone face down on the table and walked to the window. The mountains looked peaceful, unaware of the storm building in my messages. But the silence around me didn't ease anything. My body felt charged, restless, braced for something more. When the phone rang again, I ignored it, but after the 4th time I recognized the number, my father's cell. I took a breath and picked up. "Mara," he said. His voice came out heavy, worn. "Your mother hasn't stopped crying since yesterday. Your sister's beside herself. The kids are confused. Here it comes. You need to fix this." I pressed my fingers into my temple. "There's nothing to fix. You all had no right to come here. None." He sighed the way people sigh when they think they're the reasonable party. "We're family. Families take care of each other." "I've taken care of this family my entire life," I said quietly. He paused, thrown off for a second, then continued. "Look, we've already planned a move-in day. Saturday. Let's not make this ugly. Saturday." They were still coming. They were treating my boundary like a suggestion. I closed my eyes. "Dad, if you come on Saturday, I'll call the sheriff." Silence, a long one. Then he said, voice cool and disappointed, "This is not how we raised you." I ended the call. The weight of his words lingered like a bruise forming beneath the skin. I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, staring at the wooden floor until the knots in the grain blurred. This wasn't over. This was barely the beginning. I needed air. I grabbed a sweater and stepped outside. The crisp bite of the mountain wind hit me instantly, but it was grounding. I stood on the porch, inhaling deeply. From down the road, I heard the crunch of footsteps. I looked up to see Mrs. Rowan walking toward me, holding a small basket, as if she were delivering peace offerings. "I thought you might want some fresh bread," she said, lifting the basket slightly. "You didn't come out yesterday after they left." Her kindness nearly undid me. "Thank you. It's been a lot." She nodded sympathetically. "I can only imagine." We stood there quietly for a moment. The wind rustled through the pines. Then she said, almost reluctantly, "I didn't mention this yesterday, but your mother came by earlier in the week. She asked me how often you're away for work." My breath hitched. "What? And your sister was driving around the neighborhood 2 or 3 times a day the past week. I thought she was just visiting, but now I'm not sure." A slow dread unfurled in my chest. They were scouting. Mrs. Rowan hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." I pressed my hands to my face. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't even about need. They strategized this. They had made a plan. "I'm so sorry, dear," she said softly. I lowered my hands. "No, thank you for telling me." She lingered another moment, then gave my arm a gentle squeeze. "You're not wrong for setting boundaries, Mara. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She walked away, leaving the scent of warm bread and a faint trace of comfort behind her. When I went inside, the phone buzzed again. This time it was Jess, my coworker. "You okay? You didn't sound great yesterday." I debated lying. I debated brushing it off. But I typed the truth. My family tried to move into my house. There was a pause. Then, what, like? Permanently, yes. Holy crap. "Do you need anything? Do you want me to come up there?" "No, I just needed to say it out loud. Talk anytime, okay?" I stared at her message for a long moment, grateful in a way I didn't know how to express. But the gratitude didn't erase the gnawing fear beneath it. Because after Jess's message, the phone finally stopped vibrating. Completely. And that bothered me more than anything. My mother always escalated. She always responded. She always had a last word, a final guilt trip, a new tactic. The silence meant she was strategizing. The silence meant she was planning something bigger. I tried to keep working that afternoon. I sat at my drafting table opening the design files for the new cabin project near Rocky Ridge. I tried to focus on the pitch deck due next week, but every time a pine branch brushed the window or the floorboards shifted under their own weight, I jolted. My concentration frayed like an old rope. Late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with one new text from my father's number, but the tone was unmistakably my mother's. "Move-in day is Saturday. We're still coming." It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. I set the phone down carefully, as if it might shatter in my hand. My ears rang, my throat closed. My heartbeat thudded so loudly I could feel it in my jaw. They weren't reconsidering. They weren't backing down. They were doubling down. A storm rose outside, fast-moving clouds rolling over the peaks, casting long shadows over the cabin. The wind howled low through the pines, sending needles drifting across the deck. As I watched the storm build, my resolve crystallized. I wasn't going to wait until Saturday to see what happened. I poured myself a glass of water and walked outside to the porch. For a long few seconds I just stood there, letting the cold sting my face. Then I whispered, "I won't let them do this." I didn't know yet exactly how I would stop them. But I knew the locks were only the beginning. That evening, as the sky darkened and the storm winds rattled the windows, I wrote a list on the back of an old grocery receipt: "Call sheriff if they return." Document everything. Block their numbers. Prepare paperwork. Be ready. My handwriting wavered, but my intent didn't. Just as I set the note on the counter, my phone buzzed one last time. Unknown number. I clicked it open. If you think locks will stop us, you're delusional. No name, no signature. But I knew exactly who it was. I turned the phone over screen face down on the counter. Then I walked to the window, staring out into the dark curve of the mountain road, and said quietly to myself, "They're planning something. But so am I." I woke before dawn on Saturday with a heaviness in my chest that felt almost physical. The wind outside pushed against the cabin walls in long, hollow moans, as if the mountain itself sensed what was coming. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands clasped, staring at the soft orange glow rising behind the ridge. My coffee went cold untouched on the nightstand. Today was the day they said they would come. Move-in day. I made my way downstairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing through the silence. I spread the paperwork across the kitchen table again. The deed, the mortgage, the tax statements, the insurance policy. My own armor laid out in rows of neat legal language. My phone vibrated. A text message from Mom, time-stamped 5:42 a.m. "We're leaving now. Have the front door unlocked." I stared at the words until my vision blurred. Not a question, not a request, an order. The sun was barely above the treetops when the rumble of an engine drifted up the hill. I stepped to the window just as the white moving truck appeared around the bend, followed closely by my parents' SUV and Lydia's minivan. The three vehicles pulled into my driveway in a tight formation as if they were an invading force. Doors opened, bodies spilled out. Owen was the first to shout. "We're home, Grandma said we live here now." My pulse stuttered painfully. Piper twirled in the driveway, lifting her arms as if welcoming mountain air into her lungs. Mom began directing immediately. "Mattresses go inside first. Don't scratch the frame. Harold, grab that box from Lydia's trunk." Lydia slammed her door shut and marched toward my house without hesitation, ponytail swinging. "Let's just get this done," she told the movers. "She'll calm down." I stepped onto the porch, gripping the railing so tightly the wood dug into my palms. "Stop," I said, trying to steady my voice. "No one is going inside." Mom froze mid-step. Slowly, she turned. "Mara, don't be ridiculous. We talked about this." "No," I said. "You talked about it. To yourselves, without me." Dad approached, jaw tight. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "This is trespassing," I said. "I asked you not to come." "That's not how family works," Mom snapped. "Unlock the door." "No." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Lydia marched up the porch steps and grabbed the doorknob. She twisted it. Locked. She tried again, harder this time. When the knob didn't budge, she yanked on it and turned toward Dad. She changed the locks. Mom gasped dramatically. "You changed your locks. On your own family, you tried to break into my home," I said. "Yes, I changed the locks." Lydia let out a harsh laugh. "You are unbelievable." Piper tugged Lydia's sleeve. "Mommy, why won't Auntie let us inside?" I felt something within me splinter. Not break, just shift. These children were being used as shields, as leverage. But I didn't bend, because I said gently, "This isn't your home." Mom's face darkened. "We're not doing this." Harold checked the back. Dad hesitated, then walked around the house. A moment later, I heard him rattling the back door, then the mudroom, then the basement entry. "They're all locked," he yelled. "Of course they're locked," I called back. One of the movers whispered something to another, clearly uncomfortable. Owen kicked a pine cone. Piper sat on a rock, confused small hands folded in her lap. Mom stormed up the steps and stopped inches from my face. "This is not okay. We have a truck full of furniture, Mara. We're moving in." "You agreed I never agreed," I said, voice low. "Not once." "You misunderstand everything," she said, jabbing her finger toward my chest. "We're saving you from loneliness. You're wasting this place living up here by yourself. This is my home," I repeated. "It's family property," she argued. "We contributed $1,000, I said, 3 years ago. A gift, not a loan." Mom's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. It gave us a stake in this home. No, I said. It didn't. Lydia dragged another box from the truck and threw it onto the ground. The tape ripped open on impact, spilling toys and framed photos across the dirt. A picture of her with Piper slid toward my feet. Someone had written "Home Sweet Home" in glitter marker across the bottom. The symbolism was suffocating. Pick that up, Mom barked at the movers. She's being dramatic. We'll get inside soon enough. Families adjust. My breath left me in a single violent exhale. I stepped back inside the cabin, shut the door, and locked it again. Their voices rose into a chaotic chorus outside. Mom pounding, Lydia shouting, Dad cursing under his breath. The movers standing awkwardly. My pulse thudded in my throat. I walked backward into the living room, trying to steady my shaking hands. This was it. The moment the deputy had warned me about. I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Cedar County Sheriff, how can I help you? There are people attempting to enter my home, I said. My voice strangely calm. I told them not to come. They refused to leave. Is anyone inside with you? No. They're outside. Do they have weapons? No, I said, but they have a moving truck and they're trying to force entry. We'll send deputies, the dispatcher said. Stay inside. Do not engage. I hung up. Outside, Mom banged so hard on the door that it shook in its frame. Mara, open this door. We're not doing this. You are trespassing, I called back. I am asking you to leave. You are humiliating us in front of strangers, she yelled. You're humiliating yourselves, I said quietly. Minutes passed. Then sirens. The sound echoed up the slope, bouncing off the pines, growing louder as 2 police cruisers climbed the hill. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, casting fractured colors across the cabin walls. Lydia swore under her breath. Dad stepped back from the porch. Mom's eyes widened with something between fear and outrage. The cruisers stopped. 2 deputies got out. Deputy Hartman approached the porch. Good morning, he said, firm but not unkind. We received a report of trespassing. Mom immediately pointed at me. Our daughter is having an episode. This is a misunderstanding. Deputy Hartman lifted a hand. Ma'am, I need to ask. Do you live here? Mom blinked rapidly. We're moving in today. This is family. Do you live here? He repeated. No, she said tightly, but we have a right to be here. Do you have documentation proving ownership? Dad stepped forward. We helped her buy the place. That's not what I asked, the deputy said. He turned to the door. Miss, are you inside? I unlocked the door and stepped out, folder in hand. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but I stood tall. I'm the owner, I said. I have the deed, mortgage, tax, documents, insurance policy. I handed the folder to Deputy Hartman. He flipped through the pages carefully. These are all in your name. Yes. Mom lunged forward. She stole this house. We gave her money. The deputy raised an eyebrow. Do you have any documents proving shared ownership or a loan agreement? Mom opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Lydia's face twisted. You're taking her side. You don't understand, ma'am, the second deputy said, stepping between us. What we understand is the documentation. And the documentation says this is not your property. But we're family, Mom cried. And she has asked you to leave, Deputy Hartman said calmly. Multiple times. Dad's jaw clenched. We're not the bad guys here. Deputy Hartman lifted the folder again. This is her legal residence. If you enter without permission, it is trespassing. If you attempt to force entry, it becomes breaking and entering. The words hit the air like hammer blows. Owen began crying. Piper clung to Lydia's leg. Lydia glared at me through the tears. How could you do this? I looked at her, my voice low but steady. You don't get to take my home. Mom's face contorted with rage. You will regret this, Mara. Deputy Hartman stepped between us, voice steel. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to gather your belongings and leave the property immediately. Dad muttered something under his breath but nodded stiffly. The deputies stood by while Lydia and Mom collected the scattered boxes, while Dad helped the movers load everything back into the truck. The entire time Mom glared at me as if I'd betrayed some sacred vow, as if boundaries were betrayal, as if autonomy was cruelty. When they finally got into their vehicles, Dad rolled down his window just long enough to say, "This isn't over." Then they drove away. The sirens faded, first the engines next, and finally the rumble of the moving truck dissolved into the mountain silence. I stood on the porch gripping the railing. My hands were cold, my breath shook. But beneath the shakiness was something fiercer, relief, resolve, a kind of victory I'd never tasted before. Deputy Hartman returned the folder. "Would you like to file a formal trespassing report?" "Yes," I said. He nodded. "We'll document everything." After they left, the porch felt impossibly quiet. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the clean scent of pine sap. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle over me. Two things were certain: they would be back, and I would be ready. The silence that settled after the police left felt strangely heavy, like the air inside the cabin had thickened with everything unspoken. I paced the living room, unable to sit, unable to rest, my mind spinning through every detail of the morning. Their faces, their voices. The disbelief in my mother's eyes as the deputies told her to leave. The anger simmering behind my father's tight jaw. Lydia's glare, the kind that promised retaliation. I kept waiting for the adrenaline to fade, for my hands to stop trembling, but the tremor stayed, because none of this was over. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. I forced myself not to look. I already knew the messages would be laced with accusation, guilt, and threats. I wasn't ready to read any of it. I finally collapsed onto the couch, folding my knees to my chest. The room was too quiet now, the ticking of the old wall clock too loud. I kept replaying one detail I hadn't been able to forget: how easily they'd expected to walk inside. How confidently they'd spoken as though this home belonged to them. How certain they were of their right to my space. And the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist, was how a small part of me expected to cave. To apologize. To smooth everything over so I wouldn't be the villain in their story. But I hadn't. And now the consequences were coming. By late afternoon, the silence outside had become oppressive, but inside my phone was anything but quiet. When I finally picked it up, 47 missed messages filled the screen. Mom: "You humiliated us. Everyone saw what you did." Dad: "This isn't over. Lydia: I hope the cabin keeps you warm when you're old and alone. The kids don't want to see you again." I closed the message thread. It didn't hurt the way it used to. It was sharp, yes, but no longer capable of sinking deep. Something inside me had shifted too far to be dragged back. Late that evening, I walked outside with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The mountains were still, the moon bright against the dark sky. I sat on the porch steps and let the cold air sting my cheeks. For the first time, I whispered the thought aloud: I'm done letting them take pieces of me. It felt like a promise. A quiet one, but real. The next day, I returned to work. The office felt jarringly normal after the chaos of the weekend: the scent of burnt coffee, the low murmur of coworkers chatting, the tapping of keyboards. But the tightness in my chest hadn't lifted. Jess slid into the chair beside me during lunch break. "You look exhausted." "Are you okay?" I hesitated. Then I told her the truth. My family tried to move into my house. She froze with her sandwich halfway to her mouth, like, "Permanently?" "Yes." She blinked. "Holy, are they insane?" "I think so," I said softly. She leaned forward. "What did you do?" "I called the sheriff." Her eyes widened. Then she nodded with something like pride. "Good. Seriously good. Boundaries, Mara. This is huge for you." I sighed. "It doesn't feel huge. It feels terrifying. That's usually how huge things feel." Her support warmed something in me that had been cold for a long time. But the warmth didn't last. Halfway through the afternoon, my office phone buzzed. "Unknown number," I answered cautiously. "This is Mara." A clipped woman's voice replied, "Hello, Ms. Monroe. This is Officer Riley with Cedar County Child Protective Services." My blood turned cold. Child Protective, we received a report yesterday regarding concerns about 2 minor children, Owen and Piper Monroe. The report states that their aunt forcibly removed them from a stable home environment and denied them a place to live, resulting in potential homelessness. My pulse roared in my ears. "No," I whispered. "No, none of that is true." "This is why I'm calling," Officer Riley said. "We need your statement to clarify what happened at your residence." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone so hard it creaked. My family had weaponized CPS, using the kids as ammunition, using government resources to punish me. I swallowed hard. I'm the one who called the police. They tried to move into my home without permission. The children live with their mother and grandparents. They were never homeless. Officer Riley took notes. "Thank you, Ms. Monroe. Based on your statement and the initial police report, this appears to be a family dispute, not a child endangerment issue. But if we receive additional reports, we may need to follow up." I pressed my free hand to my forehead, meaning my family could keep calling. Unfortunately, yes. But repeated false reports carry consequences. I just need you to be aware. After she hung up, I sat frozen in my chair. Shame, anger, disbelief. They blended together until I couldn't tell which feeling was which. I stared at my hands trembling above my keyboard. Jess stopped beside my desk. "Hey, what happened?" "They called CPS," I said hollowly. "They said I made the kids homeless." She inhaled sharply. "That's evil. That's not even manipulative anymore. That's malicious." I nodded numbly. "They'll keep escalating." "Then you'll keep protecting yourself," she said firmly. "You're not alone." Her words steadied me, but only slightly. Even when I returned home, the cabin felt less safe. Not because the locks weren't strong, they were, but because the threat wasn't physical anymore. It was something else. Something unhinged and unpredictable. That night, my father showed up. I heard the crunch of gravel around 6 just as the sun slipped behind the ridge. My stomach tightened as I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there with his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, head lowered. I opened the door halfway but kept my body blocking the entrance. "Dad," I said quietly. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "Can we talk?" I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. "Talk," I said. "But you're not coming inside." He nodded slowly as though bracing himself. "Your mother's convinced you hate us." "I don't hate you," I said. "I just need boundaries." "She's hurting," he said. "She hasn't stopped crying." "And Lydia, Dad," I interrupted. "We're not doing the guilt thing right now." He ran a hand over his face. "This could have gone differently." "Yes," I said. "If you had asked me, if you had respected my home." "We were trying to help you," he said. "You're isolated here. We didn't want you to end up alone." "You mean you wanted a free house?" His expression tightened. "That's not fair. It's the truth." He looked away, jaw working. "Your grandmother left you money for that down payment. She believed in family. She would be heartbroken to see what you're doing now." The words hit like a stone to the chest. There it was, the weaponization of memory, the closest blade they had to my heart. I blinked against the sting in my eyes. "You don't get to use her like that." His shoulders dropped. "Mara, we're running out of options." "For what I asked," voice rising. "To take something that isn't yours." He flinched, then steadied himself. "Your mother wants you to apologize." I stared at him in disbelief. "For what? For calling the police," he said. "For creating this spectacle." I laughed, sharp, humorless. "They brought a moving truck to my doorstep. That was the spectacle." He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his eyes softened unexpectedly, something like exhaustion. Something like defeat. "I don't know how we got here." "I do," I said. "It's been like this my whole life. You just didn't notice." He swallowed but didn't argue. We stood there quietly as the wind rustled through the pines. He finally pulled away. "Your mother will reach out again." "I don't want her to," I said. "She will anyway." I nodded. Then I'll be ready." He turned toward his truck. Paused. I never wanted this to turn ugly. "It didn't have to," I said softly. He opened the truck door, hesitated one last time, then got inside and drove away. I stood on the porch long after his taillights disappeared into the tree line. The cold seeped through my clothes, but I didn't move. Not until the stars came out. Only then did I whisper into the dark, "I didn't start this, but I'm going to finish it." Inside, my phone buzzed again. I didn't check it. I turned it face down on the counter and let the cabin swallow the silence around me. But deep down, I knew the quiet wouldn't last. My family had already escalated once. They would do it again. And when they did, they'd find me standing exactly where I am now, protecting the one thing they can no longer take from me: myself. I was halfway through reheating leftover soup when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it after weeks of unknown numbers spewing guilt or threats. I'd trained myself not to react. But something made me check. "This is Gloria from next door. Someone just tried to get into your house through the back. I called police. You should come home." The bowl slipped from my hands and clattered into the sink, splashing broth across the counter. My breath stalled. For a moment, the kitchen seemed to tilt. Someone. At my house. Trying the door. My keys were in my hand before I realized I'd grabbed them. The drive up the mountain blurred. I pushed the speed limit the whole way, fingers clenched around the steering wheel, heart battering my ribs in a steady, frantic rhythm. Every turn in the road felt like a countdown. Every tree branch brushing the hood sounded like an intruder at the door. When my cabin finally appeared between the pines, 2 police cruisers were already parked out front, blue lights flashing silently through the cold dusk. Their presence painted the snow in eerie color, and underneath that wash of blue I saw the uniform shapes of officers near my back deck. My stomach dropped. Gloria stood on her porch in a cardigan arms, wrapped around herself despite the cold. The instant she spotted me pulling in, she hurried toward the driveway. "Oh, thank God you're here," she whispered, voice trembling just enough to show this scared her too. I didn't know what else to do. I heard someone on your deck, heavy footsteps. Then the door handle rattling. My pulse hitched. "Did you see who it was?" She shook her head. I was too far away. But it looked like a woman. Dark hair, ran off toward the road before the police arrived. Dark hair. The words sliced through the air like a knife. "Lydia," I murmured. Gloria's lips pressed into a tight line. I thought so too. I walked past her before I could respond, needing to see for myself. Officer Hartman, the same deputy from move-in day, stepped toward me, expression professional but edged with concern. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Good thing you came quickly." "What happened?" My voice came out tight-clipped. Hartman gestured toward the back deck. "We found evidence of a forced entry attempt. Looks like someone tried to pry open your doorframe." I followed him toward the deck boots crunching across the frosty planks. And there it was, the damage illuminated by a beam from the officer's flashlight. Fresh gouges in the wood around the lock, splintered edges where a tool had been wedged between door and frame. Someone had tried to break into my home. I reached out and touched the wood, the grooves biting back against my fingertips. My heart thudded a slow, painful rhythm. "She really did it," I whispered. "She actually tried." Hartman's voice softened. "You know the person, most likely," I said, swallowing hard. "My sister," he nodded grimly. "Your neighbor's description matches, and you already have a standing trespass record for her." My throat tightened. "Can you arrest her, not without clear identification or footage?" he said. "But this incident strengthens your case if she attempts anything again." I closed my eyes. The wind pushed across the deck cold enough to sting. "I'll install cameras," I breathed. "That would help," he said. "A lot." The officers moved around the property a few more minutes, documenting the marks, speaking with Gloria, looking for footprints. But the frost had already begun to melt where the intruder had run. No clear tracks remained. When they finally left, Gloria walked me back toward my porch, voice quiet. "You don't deserve this, Mara," she said softly. "I've lived next to you 2 years. You're a good woman. You keep to yourself. You always help when people ask. None of this is your fault." My eyes burned. I know I whispered, surprising myself with how true the words felt. For once, I know. After she returned to her home, I stepped inside the cabin and locked the door behind me, every bolt, every latch, every reinforced piece of hardware Walter had installed. The living room felt different now, as if someone had touched the doorknob while I wasn't here, as if someone had pressed their face to the glass peering in. I sat on the couch, pulled my knees close, and let the silence settle around me. Break-ins weren't just physical, they were emotional. They splintered something inside you, made you question whether any space was truly your own. My family didn't want reconciliation. They wanted compliance, and now they wanted access. My hands trembled as I dialed the sheriff's office again. "I'd like to file an amendment to the trespassing report," I said. My home was targeted again. I believe it was my sister. The dispatcher took my information calm and methodical. "We'll add this to the case file, and we strongly recommend installing security cameras as soon as possible." "I will," I said. "Tonight." After hanging up, I sat there for a long moment, staring at the door that had nearly been pried open. Then I grabbed my keys again. The closest hardware store was 40 minutes away, but I didn't hesitate. I bought 3 outdoor cameras with motion sensors, floodlights, and a reinforced metal plate for the back door frame. By the time I returned to the cabin, night had fallen, the mountain wrapped in a cold quiet that felt both protective and isolating. Setting up the cameras took nearly 2 hours. My fingers went numb, fastening screws in the freezing air, but I kept going until the last camera blinked to life, a little red dot reflecting back at me like a promise. When I finally came back inside, I collapsed on the rug in front of the fireplace. The flames crackled softly. I stared into them until my heartbeat slowed. And then my phone buzzed again. Mom. But not from her number. Another new one. I hovered for a moment, then opened the message. "How dare you accuse your own sister of breaking into your house? She was with us all day. You're making up stories to justify your cruelty." I exhaled slowly, phone trembling in my hand. Then another message appeared. "She would never do something like that. You're becoming paranoid." And another. "You will not weaponize the law against your family. You are out of control." I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked the number. But the messages didn't stop. A minute later, another unknown number lit up my screen. "Why are you lying about us? Why would we want your stupid cabin? You've always been selfish." I blocked that one too. Another number followed immediately. "You won't get away with this." My chest tightened, but I didn't reply. I blocked every number until the list of recent blocks stretched longer than my list of contacts. Around midnight, the cabin went still. I stood, walked to the window, looked out at the dark silhouette of trees swaying gently in the wind. The camera's tiny red lights blinked steadily back at me. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't wrong. Someone had attempted to break into my home. And whether or not they admitted it, I knew exactly who it was. In the morning over tea, Gloria texted me again. "Heard through the grapevine that a police officer visited your parents' house. Your mother is furious." My stomach clenched. That meant the investigation had reached them. That meant Lydia had been questioned. That meant the line between quietly manipulative and openly dangerous had already been crossed. I typed back carefully. "Thank you for letting me know. Staying alert." She sent a final message. "They're angry because you stood up for yourself. Keep standing." I put the phone down and felt something I hadn't felt in days. Resolve. The kind that was no longer shaking or fragile. The kind that felt rooted in something deeper. My family believed they could intimidate me, wear me down, make me give in the way I always had. But standing in my mountain cabin, sunlight pouring across the floor, I realized I wasn't just defending a structure of wood and nails. I was defending my right to peace, my right to safety, my right to exist without being consumed. And if they came again, Whether with manipulation, with threats, or with covert break-ins, they would find a woman ready to fight for herself with every resource she had. For the first time, I whispered the words aloud, letting them settle in the air like armor. They don't own me, and they don't own my life. I picked up my tea, pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and faced the windows head-on. Let them come. This time, the mountain wasn't the only thing standing strong. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked neatly between a grocery ad and a hardware store coupon, as if it weren't the spark that would ignite the next battle. I didn't recognize the return address, some attorney's office in town, but the moment I slid my thumb under the seal, a cold ripple moved through me. Inside was a formal complaint filed in my mother's name. She was suing me for $1,000. The exact amount she had contributed to my down payment 3 years ago, plus interest. I stared at the papers, the printed paragraphs twisting into something surreal. A lawsuit. Her signature. A demand for repayment of something she had explicitly called a gift. I set the letter on the table and pressed both hands against my forehead. My heart thudded in a slow, disbelieving rhythm. My mother had accused me of cruelty, selfishness, emotional abuse, but this was different. This wasn't guilt or manipulation. This was a weapon, and she expected me to fold. Light crept across the kitchen as the sun rose, but the room felt dimmer, smaller. I took a long breath, then dialed the attorney, recommended by my coworker, a man named Gregory Hayes. When he answered, his voice carried a blend of calm and practiced assurance that steadied something inside me. "Bring everything you have," he said after I explained the situation. "Deed mortgage documents, the police reports, the CPS call, details the trespassing file, and every text message you still have saved." All of that I asked. All of it, he said. "This isn't about the money. They're applying pressure. We're going to build a wall." The folder of documents I'd been growing for weeks suddenly seemed prophetic. That afternoon I drove into town and entered Gregory's office, a small, tidy room filled with books whose spines looked worn from use. He adjusted his glasses, motioned for me to sit, and began sorting through the stack of papers I'd brought. After a few minutes, he looked at me over the frames. "They don't have a case," he said simply. A breath I didn't know I'd been holding escaped my lungs. "They won't win, no," he said. "But that isn't the point. This lawsuit is designed to scare you, to force you to negotiate, to get you to bend." I rubbed my hands together, trying to dispel the chill under my skin. "So what do I do?" we respond, he said, firmly. And we counter. Counter Gregory leaned back in his chair. "We will state that the money was a gift supported by your mother's own messages from the time. We will request dismissal. And then we propose a mutual no-contact agreement." I blinked. "Meaning?" "That neither party contacts the other in any form. Ever." The relief that surged through me was sharp and unexpected. A future without constant pressure, without guilt, without surprise visits or accusations from unknown numbers. But he continued, "Your mother may refuse that. People like her often do." "Then what?" "Then," he said, folding his hands calmly, "we file our own harassment complaint." The room went silent. Harassment. The word felt heavy, real, a step I never imagined taking, a step that would mark the end of any illusion of family we still pretended to have. "Will that work?" I whispered. "With the documentation you have?" he asked. "Yes." When I left his office, the weight inside me felt different, not gone, but contained. Directed. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had someone in my corner. Outside, the late afternoon sun glowed orange against the mountains. For a moment, the world looked peaceful again. But the peace didn't last long. That night, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Again. "This is your mother. How could you embarrass us like this, a lawsuit really after everything we've done for you? Fix this." My fingers hovered over the screen. Then I blocked the number. Minutes later, another message popped up. "You ungrateful child. You think a sheriff and a lawyer make you powerful? We raised you. We made you. You owe us. Block. Another. Lydia told me you're spreading lies about us. You're sick, Mara. Get help before you destroy everyone. Block. The more I blocked, the angrier they became. They had lost access to me and they couldn't stand it. The next morning, while I poured coffee into my favorite chipped mug, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Gregory. They've dropped the lawsuit, he announced, but they refused the no-contact agreement. My grip tightened on the mug. Of course they did. Are you ready? He asked carefully to move forward with filing your own complaint. I stared out the window at the frost clinging to the pine branches. The cabin looked peaceful, untouched by human conflict, but I knew that peace was fragile. Too fragile to leave unprotected. Yes, I said. I'm ready. Then let's begin. The next 6 weeks blurred into a slow, grinding march of paperwork, dates, signatures, and statements. Gregory prepared documents. I retrieved screenshots. Deputies filed supplemental reports about the attempted break-in and the CPS call. Everything built into a case that made my chest ache to read my own family's manipulation in black and white detail. And finally the day came. The hearing. I walked into the courthouse with my spine straighter than it had felt in years. Gregory walked beside me, calm and steady. The courtroom was small, intimate, almost too quiet. As soon as I stepped inside, I saw them. My mother in a gray sweater dress, lips pressed tight. My father in a stiff-collared shirt, hands clasped. Lydia in the corner, arms crossed, eyes full of venom. None of them looked at me. None of them looked away either. They simply observed me as though assessing the damage I'd done. But I hadn't come here to destroy anything. I'd come to protect myself. The judge entered. Everyone rose. And then it began. My mother spoke first, insisting the CPS call was a misunderstanding, that the attempted move-in was a family arrangement, blown out of proportion, that the break-in allegations were fiction, that I had become emotionally unstable and had turned against them for no reason. The judge listened impassively. Then Gregory stood. He laid out the timeline calmly, methodically, piece by piece. The unannounced move-in, the police-verified trespassing, the changed locks, the threats by text, the CPS report, the attempted forced entry, the lawsuit, the messages, the pattern. Lydia shifted uncomfortably as he read aloud one of her texts. You won't get away with this. Dad rubbed his temple. Mom's jaw clenched so tightly the tendons in her neck bulged. When Gregory finished, the room felt heavier somehow. The judge took a moment before speaking. Ms. Monroe, he said, addressing my mother, this is not a misunderstanding. This is a clear pattern of harassment. Mom's lips parted. But no, he said sharply. Enough. She closed her mouth. Then the judge turned to me. Miss Monroe, based on the evidence and the testimony presented today, the court will grant your request. The words washed over me like a wave. Effective immediately, he continued, the respondents are ordered to cease all contact with you. They may not approach your residence, workplace, or attempt communication through any means. Violation of this order will result in fines or arrest. My mother gasped. Lydia snapped upright. My father's face fell into something like disbelief. But I stood still, breathing, present, upright, steady, safe. When the judge dismissed the court, I did not look at them. I didn't need to. Their outrage radiated through the room, but it no longer penetrated me. For the first time in my life, the boundaries I set were not requests. They were law. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer, crisper, real. I breathed it in like someone who'd been underwater too long. Gregory handed me a copy of the order. How do you feel? For a moment I couldn't speak. The knot in my throat loosened gradually, then dissolved. Free, I whispered. He smiled. Good. You deserve that. I drove home with the windows cracked open, letting the mountain air fill the car. When the cabin came into view, a soft brown silhouette against the green slope, my chest tightened with a feeling I hadn't expected. Relief. Not the fleeting kind, but the grounded, quiet kind that settles deep into the bones. When I stepped inside, sunlight poured across the floorboards, my house, my space, my peace. And this time there were no messages, no calls, no threats, no shadows lurking on the deck. Just silence, the kind that finally felt like mine. In the days after the court hearing, the mountain air felt different, lighter, sharper, almost unfamiliar. For the first time in months, I woke without a knot in my stomach, without scanning my phone for threats before I even got out of bed, without listening for the crunch of tires on gravel outside my cabin. I lay there under the soft quilt, watching pale morning light creep across the ceiling, and felt a stillness that was almost disorienting. This is what peace feels like, I thought. It felt both foreign and fragile. I got up slowly, making coffee in silence instead of panic. The cabin hummed with its usual morning sounds, the steady click of the heater, the faint whistle of wind through the rafters, the occasional pop of the old boards warming under sunlight. None of it felt threatening. None of it felt tense. When I stepped onto the porch, mug in hand, the valley below was shrouded in early mist. The dew on the railing glittered in the light. For a long moment I simply breathed. No footsteps on the deck. No vehicles coming up the road. No shadows moving through the trees. Just quiet, true quiet. I didn't realize how much I'd needed it until the tension in my shoulders finally began to unravel. Around mid-morning, I heard the familiar creak of the gate on the side path. Then Mrs. Rowan appeared, walking slowly toward the porch with a jar of something wrapped in a towel. "I made blackberry preserves," she said when she reached the steps. "Figured you could use something sweet." Her voice held that soft warmth of someone who understood what you'd been through without needing to say it. I stepped aside to let her sit on the wicker chair beside the door. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. I thought about the question. "Different," I said, "like the air is clearer. But also strange. I keep waiting for something to happen." "That's normal," she said, patting my arm. "Your body is still remembering the chaos." Chaos. That was the right word. Even now my mind replayed the months leading up to the restraining order, the texts, the CPS call, the break-in attempt, the lawsuit. My family's voices still echoed somewhere deep inside, even if they could no longer reach me. "I saw your mother and father yesterday," she continued carefully. "They didn't look well." My chest tightened, not with guilt, but with a complicated blend of old instinct and new understanding. What happened? They parked outside the grocery store in town. She was crying in the passenger seat. He looked exhausted. She paused. Some people walked by them and whispered. The restraining order made the rounds, apparently. I swallowed. "Do they hate me? I don't think so," she said. "I think they're ashamed. And when people are ashamed, they lash out." I nodded slowly. I didn't feel triumphant hearing they were struggling. There was no satisfaction, no thrill in their discomfort. Just a distant ache like touching an old bruise. But I also didn't feel responsible for it, not anymore. "They'll have to face the consequences of their choices," she said. "You can't live your life carrying the weight of theirs." "I'm trying to believe that," I said quietly. She smiled, squeezed my hand, and stood. "You're not alone up here, you know." When she left, the porch felt warm again. The jar of blackberry preserves glowed purple in the sun. Inside, I opened the windows and let fresh air swirl through the cabin. It felt like opening a new chapter, not a dramatic one, but a slow, steady shift into something softer. For the first time in a long time, I cleaned without urgency. I scrubbed the counters, dusted the bookshelves, swept the hardwood floors. I wasn't erasing anything. I was reclaiming my space. In the afternoon, I pulled the box of painting supplies from the closet. The spare bedroom, the one my mother had insisted should belong to the kids, had always bothered me. Their boxes had sat there briefly cluttering the floor with toys and linens, a physical reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. Now the room was empty. Clean. Mine again. I chose a soft green paint the color of young pine needles and began brushing smooth strokes across the wall. With each pass of the roller, something inside me loosened. You took your home back. You took your life back. You're allowed to fill this space with your own peace. By the time I finished, light from the late afternoon sun pooled gently across the room. It looked warmer, calmer, more like a sanctuary. I went outside to the deck and sat in my favorite chair wrapped in a blanket. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying that familiar scent of sap and cold stone. The mountain breathed around me. Sometime later, my phone buzzed. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel dread when I picked it up. It was a message from Jess. "Thinking about you today. I hope you're feeling lighter." I smiled and typed back, "I am, more than I expected." We exchanged a few messages, light, warm, normal, the kind of conversation that wasn't rooted in crisis or fear. When I set my phone down, I stared at the clouds drifting over the ridge and realized something strange. I wasn't waiting for the next disaster. I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't shrinking. The quiet didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like healing. That night I cooked dinner while soft music played through the cabin. I poured a glass of wine, lit a candle, and ate at the dining table instead of hunched on the couch the way I had for weeks. I savored the food, the peace, the stillness inside my own chest. After dinner, I walked outside and stood barefoot on the porch, letting the cold wood settle under my feet. Above me, the sky stretched wide and scattered with stars. I whispered into the night, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular. Just to the universe, maybe. To myself. To the mountains. To the part of my heart that didn't collapse under pressure, but instead held firm. Later, curled in bed with the window cracked open, I listened to the soft rush of wind moving through the forest. The darkness wasn't hostile. It wasn't something to guard against. It wrapped around the cabin like a blanket, deep and quiet and safe. I drifted off feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. But the next morning brought another shift, one I didn't expect. I was pouring my first cup of coffee when a text from Gloria lit up my phone. "Heard something from a friend whose sister lives near your parents." My heartbeat stuttered as I opened the rest. "They told Lydia she has 6 months to move out. Your father said he can't afford to keep supporting her." I sank onto a chair. 6 months. A slow exhale slipped from my lips, long and complicated. Not joy, not sorrow, just a recognition that consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real. They were happening. And for once, they were not happening to me. Gloria added another message. "Don't feel guilty. They're finally dealing with what they created." I stared out the window as the sunlight crept over the ridge. The world looked exactly the same, but something in it had changed. For years I had been the pressure valve, the fixer, the one who absorbed the fallout so no one else had to face it. Now, with me absent from their system, the imbalance was collapsing inward. I should have felt triumphant, empowered, but mostly I felt quiet. Not broken, not elated, just steady. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The restraining order had created more than legal distance, it had created emotional space. Enough that for the first time, I could see my family not as giants, but as people making choices. Bad choices, harmful choices. Choices that finally had consequences. Later in the afternoon, I walked along the trail behind my cabin. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of melting snow. Birds chirped somewhere up in the branches. Sunlight filtered through the trees in soft gold ribbons. When I reached the ridge overlooking the valley, I stopped. The world stretched before me, wide open, quiet. This is yours, I thought. This life, this peace, this path forward. I stayed there until the cold chased me back inside. When I returned to the cabin, I placed a hand against the front door, solid, sturdy, locked. Safe. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking on eggshells inside my own life. I wasn't trapped in a loop of guilt and expectation. I wasn't the version of myself shaped by survival. I was becoming someone new, someone who knew how to stand. As evening settled around the cabin, I lit the fireplace, made myself tea, and curled on the couch beneath a thick blanket. The flames cast long patterns across the room, dancing on the walls like shadows unfurling. I watched the fire, my mind quiet. The world had changed. My life had shifted, and tomorrow, whatever it brought, would meet a version of me who finally knew her worth. When I blew out the candle beside me, the room fell into a warm, peaceful darkness. I whispered into it, letting the words settle in my chest. I deserve this quiet. And the mountains seemed to whisper back, yes. The first morning I woke without checking the locks felt almost unreal. My eyes opened slowly, not in fear, not in anticipation, but in something I hadn't experienced in months, ease. The soft winter sunlight slipped through the curtains, brushing warmth across my face. For a long moment I simply lay still, letting the quiet inside me match the quiet outside. There were no footsteps on the porch, no car engines grinding up the hill, no notifications flashing with threats or guilt, just silence. A gentle, steady silence I kissed the air with gratitude for. I slid out of bed, pulled on thick socks, and padded downstairs, letting my fingers trail along the wooden banister. The cabin felt different now, lighter, as though the air itself had exhaled along with me after months of tension. I brewed coffee and opened the windows to let crisp mountain air drift through. It carried the scent of pine and thawing earth, a hint that spring wasn't too far away. I wrapped my hands around my mug and stood by the window watching morning light spill down the slope like gold dust. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like waiting. It felt like living. Around mid-morning, I pulled my hair into a loose bun and stepped into the spare room, what once had been the battleground for my family's imagined futures. Empty boxes had sat there, toys, bedding, Lydia's children's drawings, traces of their attempted occupation. Now the walls glowed with the soft green I had painted days before, the color calming and fresh. A small stack of frames sat in one corner alongside a folded quilt my grandmother had made years ago. I spread the quilt across the bed, smoothing the fabric with slow, deliberate palms. This room could finally become what I always intended: a guest room, peaceful and welcoming, not a symbol of forced obligation. I hung pictures on the wall, watercolors of the Blue Ridge Mountains, black and white photographs of trails I'd hiked, little pieces of memory I had once been too consumed to put up. Step by step, breath by breath, the room came alive. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, but meaningful. Every piece I placed felt like reclaiming another part of myself. By early afternoon, I drove into town for supplies. The hardware store smelled like cedar chips and earth, and the owner greeted me with a nod. On the way home, I stopped at a small nursery tucked beside the road and spent far too long choosing plants: mountain lavender, creeping thyme, and a pair of rugged, stubborn little blue spruce seedlings that somehow reminded me of myself. Back at the cabin, I knelt in the cool soil by the front path and dug small spaces for each plant. The ground was firm from the last frost, but not frozen, and the scent of mountain earth filled the air as I worked. My hands got dirty, my hair fell into my face, my nose turned pink from the wind. It felt wonderful. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and admired the small garden. Nothing extravagant, nothing Instagram-worthy, just intentions planted into the soil. A slow breath left my chest, the kind that felt like a release from deep inside. Later that day, I gathered a few of my grandmother's old things from a box I'd kept in the closet for years: the embroidered hand towels she'd made when I was little, the wooden bowl she used to fill with apples, the small iron candle holder shaped like a pine tree. I placed them carefully around the cabin. Every item felt like a quiet reclaiming of lineage, one that belonged to me, not twisted into manipulation or guilt. In the late afternoon, I invited Jess to visit for the weekend. She arrived just before sunset, cheeks rosy from the drive up the mountain, eyes widening as she stepped onto the deck. "Oh my God," she breathed, "your place is beautiful." For the first time, I saw it through someone else's eyes, warm, inviting, serene. "I finally feel that way too," I said softly. We spent the evening on the deck, wrapped in blankets, sipping spiced wine as the sky faded from lavender to deep indigo. The air hummed with the low chorus of night insects waking from winter. The view stretched endlessly, the mountains' dark silhouettes against a star-powdered sky. "You seem different," Jess said as she leaned back in her chair. "Not lighter, exactly. More solid. Like you finally belong to yourself." I smiled, slow and genuine. "I think I do." She nudged me gently. "You know it's okay to enjoy this. You went through hell. Look at you now." I watched my breath disappear into the cold night and nodded. I didn't know quiet could feel like this. Like safety, she offered. I swallowed. Yeah, like safety. We fell into a comfortable silence broken only by the crackle of the small fire pit between us. The flames cast soft shadows across our faces. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the warmth sink into my bones. They can't reach me anymore, I thought. Not here, not now. The next morning after Jess left, I decided it was time to finally organize the basement. I'd been avoiding it for weeks, partly because it held old boxes from a life before chaos, partly because it reminded me of the day Lydia had tried to force her way inside. But today felt different. Today I could face it without fear. The basement smelled like cedar and cold concrete when I stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the rays of light streaming from the small windows. I sorted through boxes, donating old hiking gear, storing winter blankets, tossing broken tools. The work felt meditative grounding. At one point, I found a box labeled Mara College. Inside were papers from architecture classes, a worn sketchbook, and a small framed photo of me at 21, standing proudly in front of a model I'd built for a design competition. I stared at that younger version of myself, smiling broadly, eyes full of ambition and hope. She didn't know yet how much she'd give, how much she'd sacrifice, how much she'd lose while trying to keep peace with people who never valued her peace. But she also didn't know who she'd become, someone who stood up, someone who reclaimed, someone who found strength where she thought only survival existed. I set the photo on a shelf and whispered, "I'm getting her back." Later upstairs, I made myself a simple dinner, roasted vegetables and warm bread, and ate at the small table by the window. The sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of orange and rose. Everything felt soft, uncomplicated, unburdened. After cleaning up, I curled on the couch with a thick blanket and my old journal, the one I hadn't written in since the break-in attempt. I flipped to a fresh page, held the pen above it for a long moment, then wrote, "I feel safe today." I didn't know how much I needed that until it finally came. I paused, then wrote, "This house is mine again. My life is mine again." Another pause. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors you get to close. My handwriting trembled slightly, but not from fear. From emotion, raw, quiet, real. I closed the journal gently. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The cabin creaked in its familiar way, the sound no longer unsettling but comforting, like a living thing settling in for the night. I walked to the front door, checked the lock once, then twice. Not out of panic, out of ritual, out of habit, out of love for the home that held me through my unraveling and my rebuilding. Then I looked around the living room at the soft glow of the lamp on the side table, at the warm wood of the floors, at the room filled with pieces of myself I had finally allowed to exist without fear. "You're okay," I whispered to the space around me, to myself, to the past, to the future. "You're okay now." The mountain didn't answer with thunder or wind. It answered with silence, the steady, strong silence of a place that had witnessed my undoing and now my restoration. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt something settle in my bones. This is home. Not because of who claimed it, not because of who wanted it, not because of who tried to take it, but because I chose it, because I fought for it, because I earned it, because I'm allowed to keep what is mine. The cabin exhaled softly as the night deepened. I curled deeper into the blanket, safe in the knowledge that tomorrow would come without dread, without chaos, without fear. and for the first time in a very long time, I fell asleep without a single worry about who might come knocking at my door. The morning after Jess left, I woke to a soft glow filling the loft, the kind of light that feels warm before it even touches your skin. For a long moment, I lay still beneath the quilt, listening to the gentle hush of the wind, threading itself through the pines outside. There were no footsteps on the porch, no engines grinding up the hill, no buzzing phone demanding my attention, my energy, my existence, just quiet. I stretched slowly, letting the comfort of that silence sink into my muscles, and finally rose. My bare feet touched the cool wooden floor, grounding me in a way that felt almost sacred. Downstairs, the cabin welcomed me the same way it had when I first moved in, morning air drifting through the open window, the scent of pine settling on the countertops, sunlight warming the old table by the wall. It felt like my house again. I brewed a pot of coffee, the rich smell filling the kitchen. When I stepped onto the deck, mug in hand, the world lay open in front of me. The valley was wrapped in soft fog, the mountains rising above it like quiet guardians. I took a long sip, letting the warmth settle deep into my chest. For the first time in years, the stillness didn't feel empty. It felt alive. I spent the morning tending to the small garden I'd planted near the front path. The mountain lavender had survived the cold night, its tiny buds stubbornly refusing to wilt. The spruce seedlings stood straight and unbothered, as if they understood resilience better than I ever had. I knelt in the dirt, brushing soil between my fingers, breathing in the scent of earth and hope. And as I worked, I realized something quietly profound. Every piece of this home now carried my imprint. Not theirs, not their expectations, not their demands. Mine. By noon, I moved inside to make lunch. As I chopped vegetables, sunlight spilled across the counter, illuminating the jar of blackberry preserves from Mrs. Rowan. I spread a spoonful onto warm bread and smiled at how simple things tasted better now, steadier, less rushed. That afternoon, I pulled out my journal again and sat cross-legged on the living room floor. I wrote slowly, deliberately. I am allowed to rebuild. I am allowed to rest. I am allowed to choose myself. The words didn't feel rebellious anymore. They felt true. Later, I walked to the spare room and opened the door. The soft green walls glowed under the fading light, the quilt on the bed neatly arranged. It no longer reminded me of attempts to take my home. It reminded me of the strength it had taken to keep it. I hung one last frame on the wall, a watercolor of quiet mountains meeting a quiet sky. A reminder that peace isn't given, it's claimed. By early evening, clouds drifted across the ridge, catching streaks of gold and pink from the setting sun. I curled on the deck with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, a cup of tea warming my hands. The air was crisp and cool, brushing against my cheeks like a whisper. As the first stars appeared, I let myself think back carefully, gently on everything that had led me here. The move-in attempt, the police sirens cutting through morning air, the CPS call, the lawsuit, the break-in, the courtroom, the restraining order, and beneath every moment that old familiar ache, the belief that loving someone meant letting them take and take until you disappeared. But I hadn't disappeared. I had drawn a line, and survived the storm on the other side of it. The mountains darkened as night settled in. I watched the silhouette of the pines sway in the cool breeze. This place had held me through the worst of myself, the worst of others, and now through a quiet rebirth. Inside, I lit a few candles and turned on soft music. Their glow flickered gently across the wooden walls, wrapping the room in warmth. I made a small dinner and ate it slowly, savoring each bite like an act of gratitude. After washing the dishes, I walked to the front door and checked the locks, not out of fear, but routine. Something steady, something grounding. Then I stepped outside again, barefoot on the cool deck, looking up at the sky stretching endlessly above me. I whispered, "You're safe now." Not for reassurance, but as a recognition. When I went back inside, the house felt full of light, of breath, of possibility. The opposite of how it had felt months ago when each creaking floorboard made me flinch. Now each sound felt like part of a home I had shaped with my own hands, and guarded with my own courage. As I settled on the couch with my blanket and tea, I realized this chapter of my life wasn't ending with drama or confrontation. It was ending with peace, a peace I had fought for, earned, and reclaimed. I no longer wondered what my family was saying about me. I no longer cared whether they thought I was cruel or selfish. Their narrative wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Their chaos no longer seeped into my life. The restraining order had created the space my heart had begged for all my life. Space to breathe, space to heal, space to grow roots in the place I chose. I curled deeper into the blanket, letting the crackling fireplace soothe the last remnants of old fear. The cabin glowed softly around me, warm and alive. This was mine, my home, my quiet, my life. And as the fire burned low and the mountains held the night quietly outside, I allowed myself to feel something I had denied for far too long. Joy. Real, gentle, sustaining joy. A joy that came from choosing myself, finally and fully, and letting the world reshape around that choice. I closed my eyes, and before drifting into sleep, I whispered one last truth into the dim room, the kind that settles deep into the bones. I deserve this. I always had. And now at last, I believed it. If you've ever fought to reclaim your peace, if you've ever set a boundary that changed everything, or if you've rebuilt yourself after a storm you never saw coming, I would love to hear your story in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if stories like this make you feel understood, seen, or simply less alone, consider staying with the channel. There are so many more journeys I'd love to share with you. Thank you for being here.